Good morning, everyone. As we sit here today, the war with Iran has widened into a broader regional conflict, with more than a dozen countries now impacted by missile and drone attacks on energy, tech, and commercial sites. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is at its riskiest point in decades. These developments clearly have implications for the global economy, for energy supplies, and for policy decision makers here in Washington. So we are going to examine them today. I'm Louisa Savage, editorial director of WP Intelligence, and our mission here is to help decision makers see around corners of policy and industry developments. Every week at these briefings, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across sectors to help us go quick and deep. Our subscribers to WP Intelligence also receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and technology, energy and climate, global security, and healthcare. We have a graphics library, exclusive interviews, and newsletters, as well as these briefings. So today, we're going to discuss some of the risks that business leaders and policymakers are facing and discuss how to navigate them with the help of our three special guests. Josh Rogin is our lead global security analyst here at WP Intelligence, and he is working on a report for our subscribers on the implications of this current conflict for leaders and decision makers. Welcome, Josh.
Great to be here.
Kathryn Clay is our lead energy analyst, and she will be publishing a report on the impacts of this conflict on the energy sector, particularly oil and natural gas. Welcome, Kathryn.
Great. Good morning.
And Juan Zarate is Global Co-Managing Partner and Chief Strategy Officer at K2 Integrity. Prior to that role, Juan served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism, the Counterterrorism Czar, where he was responsible for developing and implementing the U.S. counterterrorism strategy and policies related to transnational security threats. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks, Louisa.
Great. Well, here's how we'll organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to talk about the implications of this conflict for the energy sector, and we'll discuss a few scenarios for what could happen next. Second, we'll broaden out to the bigger economic picture. And third, we'll look at security risks and implications, as well as how business leaders and policymakers should be thinking about and navigating this moment. And I'd like to thank our audience for the questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing. We've used them to help shape the conversation. And throughout the hour, I invite you to drop your questions and comments in the Q&A, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. So without ado, let's dive in. First, Juan, before we get into the energy conversation, I'd love for you to take us a little bit behind the scenes inside the White House. What are the president's national security advisors likely to be looking at right now as they try to gauge risks and their policy options? You've been in these scenarios. Tell us a little bit of what that's like.
Well, there are layers of risk that they're having to manage now and inform the president about, and hopefully help inform his decision making. I think the first question, and you see the president's focus on this, is how the campaign is actually going and how the administration explains its end state, what the end goals are. And in particular, it's obviously the Department of War that is responsible for executing what's happening on the ground. Doing so now uniquely, I think, unlike the Iraq situation, hand in glove with the Israelis, and coordinating that with intelligence activity to try to affect the military goals, which in the first instance is to diminish the capabilities of Iran to threaten beyond its borders. And so that's the first order of battle, so to speak, that the president's focused on, that his advisors are looking at. How is that campaign unfolding? How is the landscape of that being reshaped? And then how are the Iranians responding? Obviously, the Iranians have responded with attacks all throughout the Gulf, into Turkey, into Azerbaijan, and elsewhere. And so part of this risk, it has to do with how you defend allies and what the force posture looks like. And so the diplomats, the Department of War, and others are worrying about how do you help those countries deal with those risks, and how do you keep an alliance alive? In fact, how do you create an alliance out of this in ways that would be advantageous to the U.S.? The third element of risk is what comes next. What are the Iranians able to do asymmetrically? Are they able really to threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz in a way that will affect the energy markets? Are there potential terrorist attacks in the homeland? Are there terrorist activities from cells and operatives in Europe? What will the Iranians do, not just today or tomorrow, but in the coming weeks? And so there's going to be discussions and no doubt concerns about that. And then finally, all of the positive and negative externalities that come from a situation like this, watching what's happening in the markets, the energy markets in particular. So having the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, very much focused on how to deal with the increased volatility and risks there, what mechanisms can be put in place. This is why the president announced that U.S. naval vessels would escort ships in the Strait of Hormuz. It's why he directed the Development Finance Corps to offer insurance for shipping in the absence of commercial insurance. And so those kinds of things are being discussed both in the White House and in the departments and agencies. And last but not least, any good national security advisor is going to be worrying about what's happening elsewhere in the world. What are other countries like China thinking about what's happening? What's Russia doing? There's a Washington Post report out today talking about the Russians supplying intelligence to the Iranians. What's happening in Venezuela, which is still an area that we're trying to control through the control of the oil markets. And so those are all the things that are happening both in the Situation Room and in the Oval Office. And of course, this is a president that has taken on the task transactionally and otherwise to control foreign policy. So I don't imagine that there are a lot of policy meetings at lower levels. These are meetings and discussions happening right in front of the president and with the president making decisions right there in the Oval Office.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great overview of where we are right now. And so jumping off of the energy piece of this, Kathryn, let's set the table for our discussion on energy. What does the spread of this conflict mean for oil production in the Middle East right now?
Right. That is the key question, Louisa. And I know we'll be talking more about scenarios and how things might evolve, but I think it is very important to just take a snapshot of where we are today. So where we are is that the Iran conflict has pushed oil prices up in the markets because of those disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz. It's has been widely reported the Strait of Hormuz is really key geography where about 20% of global oil supplies pass through from the Middle East to markets around the world. The benchmark crude price in the US or North America, which is called the Brent crude price, jumped by 10 to 13% within just a few days. So that's about where we are now. That equates to moving from roughly $70 a barrel to $80 to $90 per barrel. And we've seen in the US a slight uptick in gasoline and diesel prices. Gasoline has gone up perhaps 5 to 10%, 5 to 10 cents per gallon in the last few days. And really, why are we not seeing more impact from that? Well, it's because we are a very large producer of both oil and natural gas, and our domestic production has some latitude. We also have a lot of commercial storage of oil and refined products, and that's cushioned us somewhat. That isn't so much the case in other markets, particularly in Asia. Europe as well is seeing much higher gas and diesel prices than we are, but the real impacts so far are in China, Japan, India, and that's because they are much more reliant on imports from the Middle East than is certainly true for North America or even for Europe.
Mm-hmm. Kathryn, just paint a picture for a moment of these commercial stores that you said we have storage. What exactly do we have and how much do we have?
Yeah, so that's right. There's an entire sector of storage for crude oil and refined products. So the storage sector, these are familiar to anyone who's driven by particularly New Jersey Turnpike or many other parts of the country where you see those large white cylinders. And they're focused around ports around the country. So we have a lot of storage in the Gulf Coast, but also the Northeast and the West Coast, and that's true everywhere around the world. Europe has a large amount of commercial storage capacity, and that storage capacity is part of why we don't see as immediate a signal at the pump that when we see these news events happen on our television screens. And that's because they act almost like a buffer or a storage, like a battery storing energy, that they're able to receive excess market capacity and store that. Some companies particularly do it for arbitrage. Other parts of the storage sector are there because it just makes the system move more smoothly. It's the way that we make a connection between the imports of crude oil or refined products in an area and the timing of the pipelines, or the timing of the next stage in delivery. So that storage sector is kind of invisible, but it's playing an important role right now in shielding us from some of the volatility that would otherwise be the case.
Gotcha. Thank you. And Josh, before we move on to some of the domestic energy scenarios, talk for a moment about what the situation we're in now means for Russia, and particularly for the other conflict, the war in Ukraine.
Sure. Well, Iran's strategy has been to attack oil refineries, oil fields, processing centers, and also technology centers, cloud centers, data centers, and then commercial hubs, airports, and logistics centers in more than a dozen countries. And combining that with attacks on tankers and other ships in the Strait of Hormuz, what we've seen is a global shockwave that's growing and compounding by the day. And all major oil exporters are deeply affected, and all major oil and gas importers are also deeply affected. And what we're seeing is a reshifting of global energy supply lines in real time in a crisis basis. And everyone is making national interest decisions because there's no way to predict what the Trump administration will do tomorrow, much less in 4 weeks, much less in a year. And so regarding your question, basically what we've seen is that the Russians have been able to get a reprieve from the lessening demand on their oil and especially gas exports, because global demand is now spiked very high. The Treasury Department, in a move to try to quell the rise in energy prices domestically, has given India, for example, a license to buy Russian energy only a month after telling them they couldn't buy any Russian energy. And so that's a reprieve from sanctions, essentially. And because the prices are so high, Putin stands to receive a huge financial windfall, which will come at the expense of Ukrainian lives for sure. And so as we see countries like China restrict its oil and gas exports to conserve its reserves, and we see countries like Qatar invoke what we call force majeure, which means they're declaring that the emergency vitiates their responsibility to execute contracts, meaning they're just going to keep all of the oil and gas that they want to. That demand signal is going to spike up more and more day by day. And so it's really, a Christmas gift for Putin, in March. And, as the longer this goes on, the more leverage China will have, because it has more reserves and more refining capacity than any other country. And the more leverage Russia will have, because their squeeze was low prices and sanctions. And both of those things are being loosened as a direct result of the ongoing conflict.
That's incredibly dramatic, isn't it? Kathryn, let's talk
is.
about the energy implications here in the U.S. now. Just looking at the in sort of immediate term scenario. So President Trump has said the conflict could last 4 to 5 weeks. You've talked about how we've been able to kind of keep a lid on major price strikes for the moment. What about the next 4 to 5 weeks? What does that look like?
Yeah, so the uncertainty that we have beyond 4 to 5 weeks, as Josh said, it's very difficult to have visibility. Even in the next 4 to 5 weeks, it's not clear how things will progress. There is certainly a lot of pressure on prices, again, as Josh very eloquently described, because of the demand is being felt worldwide, and so no one is able to really shift supply from one sector to another because every country needs everything that it can get. For the U.S. in the oil side, let's maybe take oil and gas in sequence. On the oil side, if we start to see price shocks beyond 4 to 5 weeks, now we are in a very fortuitous moment. First, because we're in a shoulder season, and that means that we're not in the driving season, which will come in the summertime when gas prices would just structurally start to spike as more people are hitting the roads for summer vacation. We're also not in the depth of the heating oil season. We're coming out of the winter, and so we have that going for us on the oil side, that we're actually kind of in a shoulder season. And also going into this conflict, we were in a period of some oversupply of petroleum. So that has strengthened us so that in the next 4 to 5 weeks, it's possible we don't see in the United States big jumps in the price at the pump. If we do, the administration has a few different moves it could make. None of them are great. One is it could release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That was done in 2022 with the outset of the Ukrainian conflict by President Biden. And it did have a short-term success of smoothing out some of the immediate price spikes. So perhaps over 3 to 4 months, analysts think that was successful in lowering prices. So the administration could do that again. Now, however, we have not replenished the SPR since 2022. So there isn't as much there. There's, over 400 million barrels. Its max is perhaps 730 million barrels. So it's not at zero, but it's not replenished from the last time that we did this. So, and that's also a short-term one and you're done kind of move. So once you've made that move, they're probably not going to have that again if they need it again, if this is a prolonged conflict. The other move that they could make, and this was proposed in 2022, was a federal gas tax holiday. That did not occur in 2022. Congress did not approve it. The gas tax is about it's actually exactly 18.4 cents per gallon, which is a small fraction of the total price of gasoline. But it is a move that has a lot of political resonance. And so we could see that taken as a demonstration of effort on the behalf of the administration to address consumer concerns. The downside of that is that if we had a full gas tax holiday, it means billions of dollars would not be put into the Highway Trust Fund. And for the long term of our national infrastructure, that is very problematic. So, I think I'll maybe stop there. I know we'll be talking about natural gas a little bit further on, but that's kind of the near-term picture and the options that we have for gasoline and for diesel.
Mm-hmm. Josh and maybe Juan as well, how likely do you think this 4 to 5 week scenario is at this point from what we're seeing? Maybe Josh first and then Juan.
Yeah, I'll go quickly first. The 4 to 5 weeks that you'll hear defense officials talk about refers to what they see as they're planning for a military-only scenario to reduce the Iranians' capability to threaten the U.S. and allies with ballistic missiles and to sufficiently degrade its infrastructure where they think that basically they've bombed everything that they're going to be able to bomb. Now, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff yesterday, maybe they're a little ahead of that schedule, but that's essentially what the campaign was designed around. Now, two caveats. One is that now that we're 5 days into it, all of a sudden there's reporting that, oh, wait, maybe we're going to have to do this a lot longer. It turns out the Iranians are a little bit more resilient than we thought. And there's a lot more, even if you kill a lot of Iranian generals, they got a lot more Iranian generals that you got to kill. And overall, the reporting is that they're making alternate plans to perhaps continue this military campaign as far as to September. Everyone knows that Trump's not going to want to be doing this in November when the midterms happen. So he's got to wrap it up before then, and enough before then the thinking goes, so that the markets and the prices can stabilize. He doesn't want people going to vote in the middle of, an economic calamity, because that's not going to go well for the Republicans. So September does seem like kind of like a hard deadline in that sense. But then again, wars have a way of developing that in ways that you can't predict. So the first caveat is that. Second caveat is this timeline is only a military timeline. It has little or nothing to do with the political, much less diplomatic aftermath of the campaign and how that plays out. And what the options are all bad. There could be a civil war. There could be a ground invasion. Now we're hearing there could be partner forces. We arm thousands of Kurds to go get slaughtered by hundreds of thousands of Iranians, or we encourage the Iranian people to rise up and get slaughtered by their government. And so all of these scenarios are complicating. But when we say 4 to 5 weeks, that's essentially the major military operations, which would, in the best case scenario, I guess you could say, end in about a month. And then what we'd have essentially is a mow the lawn situation, where we just sort of bomb continuously at a low or medium boil, like we did in Iraq after the first Gulf War, and hope it all works out. And so, I don't think anyone thinks that we're going to be able to stop, that the U.S. government's going to stop before the 4 weeks, because look how it's going. If they stop now, then Iran would declare a victory. Most of their infrastructure would be rebuilt in a matter of months. We'll be right back where we started. So I think 4 to 5 weeks of bombing is the best case scenario, and 5 to 6 months of bombing is another scenario. And either way, the economic and trade and industrial ripple effects are just beginning at that point.
And what do you think about that, Juan? What do you think about that 4 to 5 week scenario?
Yeah, I think Josh's analysis is spot on. I think, the time that was taken to align forces in the region and to plan along with the Israelis really had a maximalist strategy attached to it. And with that comes not just a campaign of a few days, but certainly at least a few weeks. And as Josh mentioned, the initial goal is to make sure that all of the launchers, the key sites, the nuclear sites, the ballistic missile installations, the key offices of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and elements of the security establishment are destroyed. And so that will take time. Another factor at play here, as I mentioned earlier, is Israel's fundamentally involved, right? Recall the first Gulf War, where there was such a deep desire to have the Israelis not involved. And in fact, Saddam Hussein at the time sent Scud missiles toward Israel, and the diplomacy was around ensuring that the Israelis were not involved. We have the exact opposite situation here, where the U.S. and Israel are operating together, which creates another set of factors in terms of what the Israelis want in all this and how long they're willing to move forward. And one can imagine scenarios where the U.S. offers and continues its campaign with massive firepower for 3-4 weeks, and then, as Josh mentioned, there's a more targeted campaign over time that the Israelis execute, or there are elements on the ground through intelligence services or special operations forces that work with opponents to the regime. So there are different scenarios that play out here that will take weeks, not days, and I think that's right. The other factor here, and this goes back to Josh's earlier point about the oil markets and sanctions in Russia. There's an interesting question here about how much of the Iranian economy and infrastructure we destroy. We will want Iranian oil and gas longer term for the markets. This is what we've seen in Venezuela with the accommodation made for the trade of Venezuelan oil, controlled by the U.S. government now with the removal of Maduro. And so there's something very interesting and important about this question of how much of the key sector, frankly, for the economic benefit of the IRGC and many of the generals is kept in place in order to provide future supply, if not also future income for what comes next in Iran. And this goes to the larger question, and it's the major question that's been at play for the U.S. government in the application of sanctions against countries with oil resources. How do you restrict their ability to profit from those resources while still allowing the flow of oil and gas in the markets. This has been the major gap in the Russian sanctions regime from the get-go. And to Josh's point, the Trump administration has tried to restrict that more and more over time with India by sanctioning some of the Russian oil giants recently. But now this is all sort of going in the opposite direction because of the need for Russian oil and gas, given the state of play. So oil, gas sanctions form a major global complication, but it ties everything that's happening in Iran, Russia, and even Venezuela in a very interesting tableau of sanctions.
That is really interesting in terms of connecting it not just to the U.S. military aims, but also what the Israeli aims are and how the whole conflict isn't necessarily just within Washington's control here right now, that it has spread more broadly. Kathryn, going back to the scenarios for U.S. oil and gas, if the bombs don't stop flying, this conflict continues into the spring and summer, what should we expect to happen in the U.S. energy sector? And we have an audience question asking, is it reasonable to assume that oil and gas prices will continue to rise throughout this conflict and beyond? And you can take oil and gas separately if you like.
Well, that's a great question from our audience member, and great. That's the central question you're also posing, Louisa. I would like to take a step back, looking at history before I look forward, and that is to just take a moment to recognize that we are in a much stronger position as a nation than if we had envisioned this scenario in Iran happening where we were, say, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. We would not have imagined that we would be in as strong a position as we actually are today. And that's because the shale gas and shale oil revolutions put the US back on the map as really an energy superpower. When I was working on Capitol Hill back in the early 20-aughts, we were talking about siting LNG import terminals. We were running out of natural gas. We were looking at being a massive importer of oil and gas as our future. And, I just think it's worth taking a moment to just recognize how monumental a shift has occurred in this nation over the last 10 years that puts us in a remarkably stronger position and actually also makes the world a less dangerous place because the US has that strength and that ability to shore up Europe and other markets with our exports. So to that point, though, as much as we are a contributor and are going to bring strength to the world in that way, we have limits to how much we can do. And the natural gas side is the part that I am perhaps most worried about. As Josh mentioned, the Qataris have lost the ability to export LNG because of Iranian hits to their infrastructure. That's about a 20% global share in loss of that LNG capacity going down. And LNG export facilities are not facilities that you can simply switch on and off. So especially, and we don't know the extent of the damage, but even just a normal shutdown would require weeks to restart because of the sequencing you've got to go through with these enormously complex cooling chains. So we can count on 20% of the natural gas global supply being offline now for months, no matter what else happens, no matter how long this conflict does or doesn't continue. So natural gas prices are where I think we're going to see the first pain points, and we're going to see that first in Europe because that's the largest customers for Qatari natural gas are in Europe. What that's going to mean is, it's kind of a mixed blessing for the US. On the plus side, it's going to mean that there's enormous pull for LNG exports from US producers. And not just LNG exporters will benefit from that. That helps our trade balance. There could be other economic, contingent benefits that come from that. However, on the downside, increasingly our regional natural gas prices are linked to global natural gas prices. That didn't used to be the case, but it's becoming the case now. And if we see large increases in our exports, and we do have some more spare capacity that we could be increasing our LNG exports. And now the market is giving every indication to our producers that that's the way to go, we are likely going to see then increased natural gas prices at home, and the largest market contributor to electricity, well over 40%, comes from natural gas. So higher natural gas prices at home will inevitably mean higher electricity prices. And of course, that is part of a very large and growing political debate about affordability. And I think even more than gasoline prices and the so-called pain at the pump, it's the pain at opening the electric bill that is going to be where this is felt and where we're going to be talking about it the most over the next few months.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to invite the audience to please keep sending in your questions so that we have time to get to them. Josh, as we start to sort of pull back the lens from the U.S. Energy markets, looking more broadly, talk a little bit about what China has been doing in energy markets, and then we'll talk about the broader economic impacts of this conflict.
Sure. The Chinese government strategy has been very calm and calculated. While publicly calling for an end to hostilities, very quietly, the Chinese have been taking advantage of their distinct advantages in the stockpiling of not just energy, but all types of resources. And if you look at sort of petroleum reserves, you can see countries like Japan and South Korea have about 200 or so days worth of reserves on crude. Gas is much bigger problem for them. China has a unique refining capacity and excessive reserves, not just of oil and gas, but of lots of other commodities. They've been preparing for this kind of disruption for a while now. So that's one thing. So the second thing is that they're doing is that they're actually protecting their ships in the merchant ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States government has offered some financing for insurance through the Development Finance Corporation. That seems like a good idea, but I don't think it's going to give a lot of tankers reassurance if the Houthis or the Iranis are firing missiles at them. On the other hand, the Chinese ships have free passage somehow. They're able to traverse the strait untouched, and in addition to that, they're sending their naval assets to protect those ships as added reassurance. So Chinese merchant ships are really in the catbird seat. And then lastly, China has restricted its own exports of energy products, and that's going to further constrain supply all over the world, and also give them the power to sort of dictate terms for if and when they want to get back into the business of letting those products leave their country. So they're just accumulating leverage. They're biding their time, and while they're publicly calling for the conflict to end, privately, Xi Jinping must think that he won the lottery, because from now until the time that President Trump shows up in Beijing, China's advantages will only increase. And then think about what's going to happen when Trump gets to Beijing. Let's say that he's not actually bombing Iran anymore. He'll still be in a very weak position where he'll need to make sure that further economic and market disruptions don't further tank the U.S. economy. And that all runs through China. So U.S. leverage in the upcoming trade negotiations is lower now due to the Iran conflict. And Xi Jinping surely knows that. And he's going to squeeze Trump for concessions on semiconductors. He's going to squeeze Trump for concessions on Taiwan. And Trump being Trump, he may just give him those concessions, or maybe not. There's really no way to know. But definitely the big winner in the war so far is China.
Josh, given that, what would you say are some of the broader impacts on the global economy? You've already mentioned the leverage that China is gaining. Where else do you see economic impacts?
Yeah, well, we're seeing, America's Gulf allies turn on Trump after a year of just being as close to Trump as, to paraphrase Mao Zedong, as close as lips and teeth. We spent a year of the Trump administration dragging tech billionaires into the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia to sign multi-billion-dollar investment deals to build data centers, cloud infrastructure, and then to give them all of these high-end chips that were sort of ratioed or at least restricted partially under the Biden administration, in exchange for gobs and gobs of Gulf money going to these U.S. tech firms. And Iran is bombing those data centers. So all of a sudden, those investments don't seem that great. And if you think about the promises that the Gulf states made, trillions of dollars of investment, a lot of it to be located on their territory, but to benefit the Trump family and also the tech billionaires for U.S. tech firms. If you were them, would you go forward with that investment right now, as Trump is, clearly, getting your country bombed on a daily basis? I don't think so. I think a lot of those things are going to slow down. And then if you think, well, where are they going to go? Well, they're going to turn to China. That's the other option for tech cooperation and investment. So it's possible that we could see, we don't know, but we could see a big strategic shift of U.S. Gulf allies turning away from the U.S. Integration and toward China. Same thing with India and, to a lesser degree, other countries around the world that are impacted. And so I think that's the big strategic shift that will happen, that will more likely happen the longer the war goes on. And what we see now is sort of a lot of these voices inside of these Gulf countries signaling, messaging very clearly to the Trump administration to wind it down. They want them to stop. And if not, they're prepared to add to the economic pain that Trump is under in order to pressure Trump. Think about that for a second. So they're going to close down more Gulf countries, and energy exporters could invoke force majeure to break their energy export contracts, placing more strain on Trump. So it's not just Iran trying to use economic coercion to get Trump to wrap it up. It's our allies too. And so that's a lot of pressure on Trump. But Trump being Trump, maybe he just doesn't care about any of that. He's just going to keep bombing anyway.
Juan, what about you? Where do you see the biggest economic impacts? And do you share Josh's assessment that this could all accrue to the benefit of China?
Josh's analysis on China is always really important, and so I would listen to anything he has to say. There's other analysts on the China issue that have argued that this is yet another episode demonstrating that alliance with China has limited benefits, right? That the inability of China to steer the course of international events, to defend an ally in Iran or even Venezuela before that, demonstrates a dimension of weakness. But Josh is right that the Chinese have made it a practice of keeping their head down, their hands clean, and trying to stay out of conflicts, including with Russia, where they've been a really important ally to Russia in terms of supply and the economy and finance. So China's clever and crafty at using these moments to their benefit, to Josh's point. But there is a perception of some degree of weakness in China's inability to affect the course of events. They're an affected actor like everybody else in many ways, even though they are a purported superpower. So that'll play out. What I find really interesting, to Josh's point, this is all playing out when we're in a moment where economic statecraft has taken on a predominant place in national security. It's now become sort of a hackneyed mantra in Washington that economic security is national security. And I think we've seen that with this administration accelerated, in some cases in a transactional way, in other ways in interesting strategic ways. The use of investment in capital as a form of power, the use of technology, to Josh's point, as a tip of the spear of national security and establishing relationships. Even making deals as part of diplomatic deals, whether it's in the context of Ukraine or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Syria, where access to minerals and oil and gas and economic concessions are a part of the diplomatic deal. This is now part and parcel of how we think about and talk about national security. And it's in that context that we have this conflict. And to Josh's point, the Iranians understand where the pain points are. And so that's why they're trying to affect shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. They're trying to affect oil and gas supplies. They're trying to hit the data centers, which are, it's the 21st century form of oil, data and technology. And ultimately, and I'm not sure I agree completely with Josh on this, but it is a question as to what this does to how the Gulf countries in particular view the United States and view the United States vis-a-vis China. We are at a moment over the last couple of years where those countries, their investment, their interests were moving much more directly toward the U.S. and less toward China. And in fact, in opposition to China in some ways. does that get affected by this threat? Does this get affected by the war? And if it goes on too long, does China look like a safe haven and a partner that's more stable than the United States? I think that's left to be seen, but I think a lot of these countries have already put a lot of their eggs in the American basket when it comes to technology and investment. And at least the early stages of this conflict show that there's a desire to defend those interests as opposed to abandon them. What happens in the longer term, yet to be seen, but China is sitting back watching, and the summit, I think, will be a pivotal moment to see how the U.S. responds. I think President Trump will walk into that summit thinking he has the upper hand. He's demonstrated the might of the American military and the ability to affect Chinese interests at a time when the Chinese economy is slowing and weakening. So I think all of this is still in formation, and a lot of this will depend on how the conflict unfolds over time.
Mm-hmm. Josh, one thing that we should look at in terms of the economics of this is in the defense industrial base, right? We've been covering this, you've been covering it in a lot of detail for WP Intelligence, particularly in light of the war in Ukraine, the demand that's put on production of munitions, of equipment, the Pentagon trying to keep up with innovation, with drone technology, AI, all of it. We've been hearing a lot of concern about the defense production side of this. Are there enough munitions to keep it up? The Secretary of War has said the U.S. has what it needs. Are these concerns overblown, or are they a real factor here?
I think, if anything, the concerns are being underplayed by both the industry and the government for understandable reasons. They don't want to admit the crisis that they're in. And of course, we know this is true because we see the number of missiles and munitions that are being expended not on a daily basis, not just by U.S. forces and Israeli forces, but all of those countries, the 12 countries that Iran is attacking, who have to use these $2 million interceptors to shoot down $35,000 drones. And you can do the math. Eventually, you run out of interceptors. And we don't produce those interceptors in any sort of volume that could replace them in any sort of real way anytime soon. So first thing that will happen is our allies will run out of these munitions, and they've already come begging for more, and we don't have any to give them. And then the next thing that will happen is that the Iranians will focus on those countries that run out of munitions to exert more pain. Now, the counter argument to that is, well, we're also destroying their ability to shoot at us as we're using the missiles. So it's in that sense a war of attrition. Can we, kill all their launchers before they drain all of our interceptors? And I have a lot of confidence in the U.S. military to win that calculation. But again, it's a worldwide problem. So just today, actually, the White House is welcoming the CEOs of major defense contractors to the White House to kick them in the rear and to tell them to get more of this stuff going as quickly as possible. And I'm sure they're willing to do that. But I had a meeting with a major defense contractor CEO yesterday, and what he told me was that it's not really just about the missiles or the munitions. It's about all of the things that go into the things that make those. So you need factories. Those factories need air conditioners. Those air conditioners need to be plugged into outlets that need energy and water. And then you need people in those factories, and those people need training in order to build these things. And that takes years, and that can only even start after they turn on the money spigot. So if they use exquisite authorities like the Defense Production Act, the government here, to get the money out the door, that's great, but it's still going to take years to ramp up. And so that's not a solution to this problem anytime soon. And so that's just the missiles and munitions. And then when you look more broadly at the overall attrition and cost of this war, you can see that it's going to deplete stockpiles in a way that not only hurts our ability to sell Europe the weapons that it gives to Ukraine to fight the Russians, first of all, but also to fulfill existing orders for European defense modernization and Taiwanese defense modernization. And a lot of these things are already on back order for years, and now they're going to be on back order for years and years more. And what the administration will say about this is like, oh, well, that's a small price to pay for winning the war in Iran. If we win, by the way, I'm sure we can bomb them forever, but if winning means establishing an Iran that's not a threat to us, well, that's not just a military calculation. That's never going to be measured in munitions and missiles. It's going to be measured in a political and diplomatic solution that respects the interests and the values and the aspirations of the Iranian people. And I don't see really any sign of that at all.
Juan, on this topic of the security issues at play, and I really don't want to be alarmist, but given your experience in counterterrorism, what is your assessment of whether this war increases the risk of a retaliatory terrorist attack on the United States?
I think authorities have to be worried about the counterterrorism factors here, no doubt. Anytime you have a conflict like this, especially with the leading state sponsor of terror in the world, that has always thought about and used strategically its proxies and militias and terrorist allies for its purposes, you have to think about what that potential impact looks like. And, that has various forms. There is the potential of highly organized Iranian-led or sponsored activity that can be devastating. Think back to the EMEA bombings in Buenos Aires, Argentina, led by the Iranians, facilitated by Hezbollah, causing enormous damage. So those kinds of attacks that are well organized. The Iranians have not demonstrated a lot of capability in recent years to do that, but they may have that, and they certainly have intelligence operatives who may want to foment those kinds of attacks. You then have the proxies themselves that may want to attack beyond their localities. Now, the good news there is Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, others, including the Houthis, are more constrained now than they were before. So their ability to exert influence beyond their locality or their geographies diminish, but still need to be of concern. And we've seen Hezbollah operating not just in the Middle East, but in Europe, certainly Latin America, West Africa. And so there has to be monitoring of those cells and activities for additional terrorist threats. And I'm sure the counterterrorism community is doing that as we speak. And then finally, you've got the lone wolf or inspired actor dimension here. Do you have people that are so emotionally or ideologically affected by events that they take it upon themselves to attack? And we've seen those kinds of attacks in the United States and around the world in the past. And so that, too, authorities have to worry about. And that's not just the federal authorities like the FBI and the CIA worrying about what comes from abroad, but the local authorities that have to worry about what a deranged or ideologically inspired individual might do, on a Friday night in some city. So those are certainly concerns that have to be dealt with. I do think strategically there's the question of what comes next, and success ultimately here is an Iran that is no longer threatening either directly or indirectly through proxies. And the very question you asked is an important one, because if you can diminish that threat longer term, you've done a lot of good here. If that threat persists, then I'm not sure what we've won. A final point, and Louisa, if you allow me, you'd asked me what's going on in the White House, the Situation Room. In events like this, it's often hard to look beyond the immediate crisis or activity. The oxygen gets taken out of the room around the particular event or threat or issue. What's difficult is connecting the dots between other things that are happening around the world, how this impacts China, how this impacts Ukraine and Russia, what this means for Venezuela and Latin America. And I think one of the things that any administration has to worry about is a crisis or a war like this, as we saw in the Bush administration with Iraq, taking up all the oxygen in the room, where you are then less able to concentrate on other threats, other factors, other policies, including on the energy side, that you need to focus on. It's not to say this administration doesn't walk and chew gum at the same time. They certainly can. But this kind of a crisis, this kind of a moment can often distract and and focus attention just on the particulars of Iran as opposed to the rest of what's happening around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add very quickly, Louisa, that I totally agree with everything Juan said. We already have had one retaliatory terrorist attack on U.S. soil. 3 Americans were killed in Austin and over a dozen wounded when a lone wolf gunman took an AR-15 to the streets. And federal investigators say they're still investigating the motive, but he was wearing a shirt with the Iranian flag on it. So let's call that a clue.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about how business and policymakers should be navigating this moment right now. Josh, you talked about some of the policy options that the government has and is using. You've talked about sort of supporting insurance for tankers going through the strait. We had a couple questions on that. I don't know if anyone can speak to these, but is there a metric that shippers will watch to determine when they will begin to transit the Strait of Hormuz at a normal pace? And secondly, how and when will it be possible for the U.S. to provide backup insurance for ships transiting this area? I open it to the group, whoever would like to go first.
I'll just start on the transit piece. What the president announced is that the Development Finance Corporation will offer a political risk insurance and guarantees for financial security of maritime trade, especially cargo in the Strait of Hormuz. What that basically means is that they're trying to backstop the insurance market so that these ships can still get insurance. Now, that's not bad. That's a good thing to do. But if the ships are blowing up, no amount of U.S. government insurance backstop is going to change that calculation. So that's, I would say, sort of kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. And then the next step that you would have to look for is the U.S. government going to devote actual naval resources to escorting these ships, which is very tricky, especially when they're in the middle of doing all of these other very dangerous things. And so I think that could happen. I haven't seen the announcement yet. As for when does this end, that I think is going to be at the minimum weeks, at the maximum months. And I think what you're going to see is a shift because the Iranians and the Houthis are going to choose which countries' ships can go through and which countries' ships get shot at. And so you're going to see that sort of a bifurcation in the shipping and insurance related markets towards those countries that can transit safely, mostly, again, the Chinese ones. And the longer this go on, the more stark that bifurcation will become. But there's no way to put an end date on any of this, and anyone who tells you that they can is lying.
Juan, we've talked about a lot of the different threats, security and economic. If you were advising, corporate executives right now, what steps should they be taking as we enter this period of volatility?
Well, I think any company, including ours, you have to worry about people that you have in the region. Obviously, we had partners and employees stuck in the Gulf trying to get back home. So worrying about the safety and soundness of your people and your facilities, if you have any, obviously becomes priority number one. I think worrying about both the direct and indirect risks to your supply chains, energy needs, becomes critical. So watching, obviously, the analysis of Washington Post, but other indicators as to where supplies are going and where supply chains affecting you directly is critical. And so, putting together, I think, a quick analysis of where that risk sits is important. I think third is where you've got broader exposure in ways that the market may be punishing. Whether it's in terms of your technology exposure or your direct investments in particular markets, I think looking at what that direct and indirect risk looks like is really critical. But I think first and foremost, when you're in the middle of a hot war, I think it's how you take care of your people and your supply chains and your infrastructure in a way that allows you to not only secure that, but to make sure you can survive the hot war and come out on the other side stronger and better. So I would layer the risk analysis in that way and have a taxonomy looking at your exposure and try to create some resilience around supply chain if you can, because I think that's going to be the biggest risk for most companies.
Kathryn, supply chain resilience around energy. I mean, is this the time to go solar? What should people be thinking about?
Well, and to my points earlier about natural gas prices pushing up on our electricity prices, that's another thing to realize is that the fact that we have been installing more solar in the last 2 years, solar installations by far were the largest new installations on our generation side of our power grid. So we're actually more insulated than we would have been more than just a few years ago. I also I would be remiss if I let the conversation end without just talking about the importance of energy prices to the economy overall as an inflationary measure, and to the point of supply chains, because supply chains involve shipping things, and shipping things relies on energy costs. Anytime that energy costs go up, we see all of our costs across supply chains, across industries go up, and that's partly why we watch energy prices and energy markets so closely. I would suggest to business leaders that, well, we're going to run out of time in this conversation, sadly, because there's so much to say. But I would suggest that there are some historical examples that you can look at that can kind of bookend the expectations of how bad or not so bad things might be. You can look as recently as the energy price shocks from the beginning of the Ukraine war. I would also suggest looking at the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And then it's further back in history, but still quite relevant, is how long inflationary pressures remained after the Arab oil embargoes of the 70s. So just because the conflict ends, maybe this is the last point to leave our viewers with from me, just because the conflict ends does not mean the inflationary pressures end. And so the ripple effects take a lot longer to work themselves out and resolve than simply the day that the Strait of Hormuz opens again.
That's a really important point. We always like to end our briefings with a quick look ahead. Josh, talk about what you're working on next for subscribers, and then I'll go to you, Kathryn, and you, Juan.
We're looking at what's going on in the lead up to the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing in April. Of course, that's a moving target now, but the idea is that the negotiations behind the scenes between Washington and Beijing are heating up, and the Chinese want to have whatever concessions or deals that they're going to announce in place beforehand. And so we're going to get into that. Does that mean tariff relief? Does that mean further technology restrictions relief? Does that mean increased agricultural purchases? Does that mean some concessions on weapon sales to Taiwan? All of these things are in play. So stay tuned and watch this space.
Kathryn?
Yeah, so in addition to developing a report on our topic today, I'm also looking at the recent presidential announcement of an agreement with major hyperscalers. So these are the owners and developers of data centers, requiring that they bring their own power to the national grid. And I'm going to be looking at how likely that strategy is to solve the intended problem that it's framed as solving, which is to try to insulate consumers from rising electricity prices as demand grows with data center growth build out.
I look forward to that one. And Juan, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm very fortunate. I'm the chairman of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That's a mouthful. We are set to publish a new doctrine on economic security. What does economic security look like and mean in the 21st century in the face of challenge from China and its allies? That's important because we're exploring how we think about the alignment of investment and capital as a form of power, how we rethink the nature of alliances, especially for key supply chains, for use of capital, and for resilience in the energy sector. And this work is being done in concert with our colleagues at FDD who are focusing on the energy sector as well as on political and military power and on what China is doing in the space. So look for more from that. And this all fits into a broader landscape of economic security, as we discussed.
That sounds like an excellent report. So we'll be following up with you on that, and perhaps we can do an interview on that topic once all the research is complete. Thank you so much, Juan, Josh, and Kathryn, Obviously, this is an issue we'll continue to cover closely at WP Intelligence. And before we wrap, a quick reminder that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking the link on your screen. And we will send our live audience a link to a recording of today's briefing. And please take a moment to complete the short post-briefing survey that we'll send you. Your feedback's very important to us and helps us think about what we can do next. And please join us next Friday for a briefing on the AI data center building boom and how it is remaking the construction industry and even changing how the electric grid is governed. So we'll be back this time next Friday. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.